next is a fireside chat with Andrew Spiegel, Executive Director of the Global Colon Cancer Association, and Anna Hyde, Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation. In her role, Anna has focused on increasing access to healthcare and cultivating opportunities for engagement in advocacy for people with arthritis. She is one of, if not the most knowledgeable patient advocates in the United States in regards to biosimilars and some of the policy issues they pose for patients.
Hello all, and at this time we're going to welcome Anna Hyde, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation, a national nonprofit organization. And Anna is going to help us understand the perspectives of US patient advocates about biosimilars. And Anna has been in this biosimilar space as long as I have. I've seen her many times in front of the FDA and on multiple panels all around the world talking about biosimilars and biosimilar policies. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Anna to our biosimilars training program. So Anna, why don't you tell us in your own words, what is this all about? What are biologic medicines? What are biosimilar medicines? And why should patients and patient advocates care?
Well, thanks you for the opportunity, first of all, to be here. I always love talking about this issue. It's such a hot topic right now. And it's also interesting to see sort of cross-therapeutic, I represent arthritis, and so immunology versus cancer, where I'm sure a lot of your audience is sort of steeped in. So I'll speak obviously from the lens of immunology, but if we take a step back, biologics generally are a relatively new discovery and option for patients, let alone biosimilars. But biologics have been around in arthritis for a little over 20 years, and it's short enough amount of time that a lot of rheumatologists and pediatric rheumatologists who practiced before that time can talk about the vast difference before times and after times. Before times being, waiting rooms. People describe them as a sea of wheelchairs, for example, and there just really weren't many options. And oftentimes the disease would be, degenerative over time, and, joint replacements and things like that were really the best option for a lot of patients to, be healthier. Then biologics come along and really revolutionize care for the arthritis patient. And you don't see many wheelchairs anymore in waiting rooms. And so it's really revolutionized quality of life. But it comes with a price tag. Biologic medications come from, they're large molecule drugs. They don't, they come from living organisms. And therefore they're difficult and expensive to produce. And we know that cost issues are a major barrier to treatment adherence and being able to even access a treatment in the first place. Those continue to loom large as issues, as we all know. Biosimilars are not generics. We don't use that term because they're not small molecule drugs, but they are sort of, alternatives to the biologic. And because they are produced in sort of the heavy lifting has already been done by the reference product, they have a promise of lowering costs and being less expensive to the health system at large and to the patient. So that's where sort of we're focused on making sure that that promise is realized and can really help patients to access their medications. And these are, biologic medications are typically called specialty drugs because they do require special care and handling and delivery. And there are really two kinds. There are self-administered, which are usually injectables. There are some oral pill versions, but most of them are either injected or infused. That's the other side. Currently in arthritis, there are biosimilars on market for one reference product, the reference product being Remicade, which is an infused drug. So at this moment, if you want to have access to a biosimilar in arthritis, we're really talking about that set of patients who take those infused drugs, which usually involves going to an infusion center, and you're doing this on a regular basis. It's not a one and done. You're going every few weeks or every couple of months. Same with the self-administered form. It's not something that you take once and then that's it. It's something that you take repeatedly. And so how that drug is delivered to you, whether it's via a specialty pharmacy or infused in a doctor's office or an infusion center, really matters and really contributes to, that cost issue that we were talking about a second ago, because it's a long game for an arthritis patient. And so having that access continuously is really critical.
Right. And so when you're talking about a reference product, what I think you're referring to is the manufacturer of this original biologic product, right?
Correct.
It's original biologic. They're the ones that came up with the formula. They're the ones that developed the product, and they're called the reference product, right? And then you have what you're referring to as a biosimilar. So what is your understanding of what is a biosimilar?
Well, if you compare, though we are very careful not to use the word generic, but if you compare it to the generic market where, the brand drug goes off patent and then another manufacturer can be free to essentially reverse engineer how that particular brand drug was made and make it in a cheaper way. The heavy duty discovery and going through the translational research and all the clinical trials and all of that has been done already. And so in theory, that makes it less expensive to manufacture. So we look at them as very similar to the brand drug. They have it should be the same mechanism of action, the same efficacy per the FDA, clinically, essentially the same.
So with this, though, over the last more than a decade, you have been one of the advocates working in this space to make sure that the patient voice is heard, because these are serious medicine. I know you and your organization have been tracking patient and physician perceptions on biosimilars, because we understand biosimilars are here. Patients are being prescribed them every day at really great, successful levels. So what data has your organization been able to put out there in terms of patient or physician perspectives about these biosimilar drugs?
In general, what we've found in the past few years from surveys and focus groups is that a lot of patients haven't heard the term biosimilar. So it's not something, unless their physician brought it up to them, or perhaps they were switched to a biosimilar from their health plan. They might have learned about the term that way, but otherwise you're not necessarily seeing this in the mainstream news or ads on television or things like that. And so when we ask patients what their knowledge level of a biosimilar is, it's usually not very high. More importantly is where they're going to go for trusted information. Number one is their doctor. And so that's why the physician relationship with the patient is so important. That's the person that they're most likely going to trust and have the most confidence in telling them what is safe and effective. The FDA is also critically important. We found that through our surveys as well. Knowing that biosimilars are FDA approved carries a lot of weight. But after that, it's really going onto the internet, which is what many of us do. And that's where we can get into some issues with conflicting information, misinformation, bias, and things like that, that we are trying to avoid.
And we all know that biosimilars can be really good for a health system, right? We understand that if, like generics were for the brand name drugs, we now see biosimilars that are saving millions and millions of dollars to health systems because there's now competition to these originator products, right? And we know that for a health system to successfully integrate biosimilars, a number of factors have to happen. And you have information about that, am I right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we know that competition matters, and having more biosimilars per reference product on market helps to just drive those competitive forces and bring down prices. We're certainly seeing that happen right now with the one reference product that we have biosimilars on market in arthritis. And I think next year will be really pivotal because Humira will be the first in the injectable space where we'll have a number of biosimilars that are approved currently potentially come on market starting in 2023. And so we hope that those market forces will do their job and help to sort of realize that promise in lower costs. We know from certainly talking to payers, to employers, that's another major stakeholder here, for whom specialty drug spending is really high, and efforts to try to rein in spending for specialty drugs has been a priority, we know, for employers and payers and others for quite a number of years. And so this is where we really think that biosimilars can help drive that, not completely solve the problems in the system, but really be an important lever to sort of drive change.
Right. And now you've been involved in the biosimilar movement since it began, I believe, around 2010 in the United States, but biosimilars have been around longer. They've been around longer in Europe. And you've also, I know, spoken about the European experience and uptake and things of that nature. So could you touch on what we can learn from Europe?
I think there are a lot of important lessons that we're able to learn from our counterparts in Europe and Canada who have had, and other countries, of course, who have had biosimilars on market for quite some time. On one hand, there's a lot of real world evidence now. There have been a lot of scripts filled for biosimilars in those countries. And that goes a long way towards helping with just general confidence in biosimilars for patients, because they generally want to know, especially with a heavy duty drug like you were talking about before, how did this drug work in someone with my same disease profile? That sort of peer-to-peer learning is really helpful and important for just general trust, comfort, and confidence in taking a drug. So having that experience data is really helpful. But we also know that there are a lot of nuances to how you talk about biosimilars that impact patient trust and confidence as well. And that's another thing we've been able to learn from our counterparts is, the words that are used in the conversation, whether it's from the provider or a payer or whomever is first introducing that concept to the patient, the words that they use matter. And when you say things like cheaper, for example, oftentimes that has a connotation of lesser or less effective. And so I think it's really important, going back to the education, that the conversations with the patient make it really clear what the FDA has said about these drugs during the approval process, clinically the same, clinically equivalent, those sorts of terms embedded throughout the conversation are really important. So it's been really nice to be able to learn those kind of lessons from our counterparts, and then hopefully to be able to apply those and scale them here in the United States as more of these come on market.
I think it's pretty well regarded that the EMA, the Europeans, have done a really good job in, number one, getting biosimilars to become a mainstream part of the healthcare marketplace. And secondly, to get physician and patient buy-in. In other words, to include the physician in the conversation about prescribing biosimilars to their patients, right? Do you think that has had any impact in driving the biosimilar success story across Europe?
I think so, and I think there's a lot of lessons that can be applied here too. We believe that buy-in from the physician and the patient is really critical to the success of biosimilars. Again, going back to that comfort level and the perception of these drugs as being efficacious and safe to use, having the buy-in can only help as the patient is taking the drug to prevent things like the nocebo effect, for example, where you may think that the drug is not going to work as well, and therefore, what happens after you take it can be impacted by that. So we really think that there's a right way and a wrong way to transition a patient or to start a new patient on a biosimilar. And we have seen some success stories here in the United States as well, where, the education and the conversation was had on the front end, as opposed to we're making this decision and it comes from the top down and you get a letter in the mail that says, you are no longer going to be prescribed this drug. Instead, you're going to take this. Call your doctor for more information, or something to that effect. We've seen that happen too. I would suggest that is not the right way to go about making that transition and making the patient feel comfortable and safe.
If you're one of those patients that you described decades ago was in wheelchairs and walkers because of this rheumatological condition, and it took you that long to find the cocktail that works for you to give you a full life. I know the speeches you're talking about where these pediatric rheumatologists say that at the old conferences, all the kids were in wheelchairs and walkers, and now they're all playing sports at school and living full lives. And it took them a long time to get there. And the last thing that a patient wants to receive is a letter in the mail saying, yeah, we know you've got your life back, but we're going to change one of those drugs and no additional information. You would say that's not a really good way to switch a person's drug, right?
Yeah, that's such an important point, and it cannot be emphasized enough. The feeling and the fear factor because of what happens to get to that point in the first place. Even now, when there are a number of biologic options for a patient, getting the diagnosis and then finding the treatment regimen that's going to work for you. In immunology, it's not a clear-cut path necessarily. And we have a lot of survey data to show that as well. It often takes 2 or 3 tries on different drugs before you find something that works for you. And, you could be on a drug and it's working really well for you for, let's say, a decade, and then all of a sudden it stops working for you and you got to start over, which is incredibly frustrating. And so any sort of change or tweak, even if you're telling someone that it's a biosimilar and essentially the same, still can carry a certain amount of fear for a patient. And that's where that kind of bottom up, having that conversation and instilling that comfort is so important.
When you think about the European experience and you think about what you said of the importance of the education of the physician, the healthcare provider, the patient, there are those that feel that physicians are the impediment to the success of biosimilars. They feel, and I know you and I know this because we were just in San Diego at a conference where this was a hot topic, that should the physician have a role in which biologic or biosimilar the patient plays? Because we see governments around the world sort of trying this, and we see payers here in the United States trying this, where they are essentially making the decision at a high level that all patients with this certain disease that are on this biologic will now either be switched to a biosimilar, or all newly diagnosed patients will go automatically to the biosimilar. So really these decisions are being made at a different level than your healthcare provider, which is worrisome, I think, from the patient's perspective, that the ones making these treatment decisions are not your healthcare provider. So I assume you feel it's important that you don't agree with those who say, take the physicians out of the equation and we'll have lots of biosimilar uptake.
Yeah, that was some serious leading the witness, Andy. But yes, because I agree with you.
I know you do.
The provider input is so critical for any sort of treatment decisions. It goes back to all the things that we talked about before, that the comfort level and trust that happens from the conversation in the exam room between the patient and the provider. And therefore, the provider really needs to be on board with what's happening. That's not to say that payers shouldn't be sort of incentivizing transitions in whatever way that means to them. I don't see those things as mutually exclusive. It just means that, going back to that conversation about a right way and a wrong way, that having the conversation with the provider and getting their buy-in to make the transition happen at the front end, rather than mandating it down without having done that critical step, that's where I think a lot of the focus should be, especially as we get into 2023 and biosimilars become much more accessible for people with arthritis.
So in talking about the US biosimilar market, I believe we've had 33 approvals in the last 7 years, roughly speaking. I lose track all the time because there's always seemed to be another one getting approved. And I believe I've read that some of them have 50, 70, 80% market share in some states of these biosimilar drugs. So I know that we're a few years behind Europe and Canada and some other places, but I think, relative speaking, we've had a lot of approvals over the last 7 years. And I think more than half of those approvals have been in the last year or two alone. So what do you think about the future of the US biosimilars market? Does it look positive to you? Does it look, challenging?
Both. I think it looks positive and challenging, but I would say more on the positive side now than I would have a couple of years ago if we were having this conversation. And I would suggest we should have it again in 2 years from now, once the self-injectable side has a chance to kind of take up some market share as well. So that's where some of the positivity comes from, for sure. We're kind of on the eve of this broader availability for people who are not on an infused product. Certainly, as we've talked about, oncology is quite ahead of rheumatology, but that offers sort of a good kind of case study for rheumatology going forward. And like I said, the more sort of real world evidence there is, the better, for a number of reasons. And the more patients can learn from other patients like them who have been transitioned to a biosimilar and had a good experience with it, the better. Same for providers. The more practices that they are aware of who have made the transition and not seen any major issues, the better as well. So that really kind of helps, I think, at the same time that payers are starting to provide more incentives for those transitions as well.
So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of switching. And I'll call it non-medical switching. Some people call it something else, but I'm going to refer to it as non-medical switching. And I'm going to define that as switching a patient's medicine for a reason other than their own benefit. In other words, a patient is being switched for a reason other than their own healthcare. And so I would call that a non-medical switch, because it's a patient's being switched for a non-medical reason. And, you know, we've kind of gotten used to that in the pill space, in the generic space, where we go to a pharmacist and, you know, we're on the same drug month after month. And then 1 month it looks different. And we say to the pharmacist, why does my pill look different? Did you give me the wrong one? No, it's a different generic, same thing. Don't worry about it. And we've all gotten used to that in chemical drugs, because we know in a chemical drug, I could give you the recipe for aspirin and you can make aspirin just as good as Bayer can make aspirin, because it's following a chemical recipe. But we know with biologics, it's much more complex than that. And so when a patient learns that their medicine is going to be switched, especially as you have described, a stable patient that may have taken a decade to become a stable patient, and then they learn that their medicine is about to be switched. And it could be switched from the original reference product to a biosimilar. It could be switched from one biosimilar to another biosimilar, because we know there's going to be multiple, or there are multiple companies manufacturing biosimilars for the original drugs. And so what advice do you have for those policymakers or those behind the scenes that are making these decisions about switching patients, of the importance of keeping the patient informed and making the patient aware and the physician aware when a switch may have to happen?
Well, there's a lot to tease out there, but maybe we'll start with what you were talking essentially about in the generic market, which is automatic substitution. That is something that was a pathway that was set in the generic market to try to increase uptake of generics, and it worked, as we all know. Didn't happen overnight, but it did. And in the same sense, you can't draw a direct parallel there, but there is also a pathway for automatic substitution in the biosimilar market. And that's where that term interchangeability comes into play, which we all know still is a source of confusion for a lot of folks. I mean, in the arthritis space, there is one biosimilar that has an interchangeable designation. It is not on market yet. It is a drug for the reference product of Humira. So that might be part of the issue, is that we don't have any use cases in the United States, and interchangeability, that type of terminology, isn't used elsewhere. It is really an American construct that was set in the statute by which biosimilars were able to become approved and on market. So I think, you know, at a time when interchangeability and automatic substitution is more widespread, then it'll be a different conversation. We certainly believe that provider notification is critical, and in state substitution laws, for example, that we've worked heavily to pass over the last few years, that's one of those components that we think is really important for post-market surveillance and all of those good things. But, you know, your question raises another point, which is that for most of these reference products, there are more than one biosimilar available. And for the one on market now, for Remicade, there are multiple biosimilars on market. And so what you're seeing is not just transitioning from the originator to one biosimilar, but potentially from one biosimilar to another. And we are already seeing this happen in rheumatology, where you may have transitioned from Remicade to Inflectra 1 year, and then the next year your payer decides that it's going to prefer Renflexis, which is another biosimilar for Remicade. And it seems to me, there's less comfort among the provider community and others to make transitions from one biosimilar to another. Perhaps there's not as much data that is available to them. That's where that interchangeability designation comes into play because of the requirement to show transitions back and forth. But we know that there are immune responses to making transitions, and I think that's where a lot of the concern comes from in the rheumatology community. So again, having that real world evidence, seeing what's happening in Europe and elsewhere, where they also have multiple biosimilars for the same reference product on market and are likely having those transitions back and forth. What data is coming out of that experience that can help drive the trust and comfort level and things like that here as well. But having that really sort of tight record of what is happening with the patient care and when there are transitions, and this will only get messier as more come on market, and being able to understand that journey so that if there is any kind of adverse impact, we can draw a line back to where that came from.
If I'm a patient and I'm a stable patient, in other words, my medicine is working, I'm feeling good, and I've been told that my medicine is going to switch for whatever reason, whether the government decided it, whether my health plan decided it, or maybe my physician has decided that they want to switch me to a biosimilar. We know that in Europe, the systems have had, huge uptake rates, huge savings for the system. And for the most part, they have allowed physicians and patients to choose between all of these different products, especially stable patients, when they aren't usually forced to switch. So what should patients really around the world be watching for in the future in this regard?
Again, going back to building some commonality around how we talk about biosimilars remains really important, using the same terminology. You mentioned non-medical switching earlier, and the fact that there's not consensus about what the terminology that we use to talk about transition, switching, non-medical switching, whatever term you want to use. But being able to understand just basically what's happening in your health coverage as you move forward is going to be really important. Being able to, again, tailor those resources and the way that we talk about these things, depending on where you are in your treatment journey, is going to be really important. And then collecting the data around that. So, as we're looking at real world evidence, it's not just when switches are happening and from what to what, but also where was that person in their disease journey? Were they a new start? If that particular drug isn't going to be efficacious in them, is it because they were a new start and perhaps that just wasn't the right mechanism of action for them? Or was it something else? Were they transitioning from a reference product that they were really stable on to a biosimilar, in which case it raises a different set of questions. So I think keeping track of all of those kinds of nuances is going to be really important for building an overall just sort of record of evidence about how biosimilars are working, both here in America and across the world.
I think what you were just describing was what we call pharmacovigilance, meaning that when the manufacturer puts their drug out on the market, they will have an obligation and a duty to track how that drug is acting in the real world patient community, so that we'll have what we call real world evidence of how that drug's doing, how patients are dealing with that drug. Is that what you're referring to?
Indeed, yeah.
Indeed. And so attendees know that a couple of presentations are going to cover that exact issue, pharmacovigilance, and we're going to hear what the WHO has been doing about making sure that these drugs are safe once they're put out in the market, because clinical trials can only do so much. We know that real world evidence is the kind of evidence that we in the patient community want to see. And so you'll be hearing from some speakers about what the WHO is doing and about what some of the other regulators around the world are doing to make sure that these medicines are safe once they're put out in the market. But I want to thank you for your time and, of course, your expertise and your commitment to keeping the patient voice in the center of these policy discussions. And I know you've been doing it for almost a decade, or at least a decade now, and you'll keep going, keeping the patients safe. And I just want to thank you for all the great work you've been doing, and thank you for participating in the Biosimilars training program.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Anna, for giving us your perspective as a patient advocate on how biosimilars are impacting patients in the United States. Anna mentioned some of the challenges patients are facing accessing biosimilars, as well as maintaining control over treatment decisions. Our next speaker will dive into this in more detail, but from the perspective of a physician.